Good evening to the author of the book, to the publisher, to Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, Vivek Debroy, Shamika Ravi, who are on the dais, and also the eminent gathering before me. I'm very pleased to be here to be part of, what should I call it, unveiling of the book, releasing of the book, because it's obviously available since September of 22. But of course, in this era, book discussions happen as the release also happens, just as we've released this book. And this is probably the first one where a discussion is happening on a very, very contemporarily relevant book. It's a very well done book, a book which is a result of intensive labor, in that as we read the book, you also realize how difficult it is to get data, how difficult it is to get some of these very critical documents. And therefore, for Gautam to have put in that kind of energy and time to compile it, bring it all together with authentic references, is a great service towards understanding Indian economy. As was mentioned earlier, it of course tracks how post-independence, leading towards 1991, 8 major steps which have been taken in the name of policies, and probably 11 prime ministers guided the economy through those years, which resulted in 1991, under compulsion or under conviction, a major reform happened. And till before that, a reform of that kind hadn't. And we have the author of 91 reform, along with many others, the author, Dr. Ahluwalia, being present here, which is itself something which all of us can look forward to hearing his views, because he's been in the thick of those days, knows how exactly it happened. If thick of those days is something which we will love to hear about, and I'm sure 30 years from now you'll hear about the pandemic time reform as an opportunity which happened. So time has its own advantage, but now we have the advantage that time gives us in the author, in the way in which he's looking back at it, with the advantage again of the writer or the person who was in the thick of things as well being here, which is a rare advantage for all of us. So not just looking back at it from historical perspective or also from the secondary data that you have, but actually the makers of the reform 1991, at least one of them, is here with us. So it will be interesting to hear Dr. Ahluwalia's picture of how 91 happened. But since after 91, 6 prime ministers, as how Gautam has recollected in the book, 6 prime ministers, but 69 major steps, all of which are reform-oriented, have all happened. And this book, therefore, looks at what was before 91 and what's after 91. Of course, gives us a picture pre-47 as well, when he's looking at the Bombay Plan and how, since then, although it has been kept in the sidelines since after independence, since then, overtly or covertly, Bombay Plan has been influencing all our thoughts and the policymakers. Not just that, it gave birth to the Planning Commission, and not just that, it influenced the first plan in a very detailed manner. So India has been fortunate that in spite of the British rule and in spite of the way in which we have wrenched out a lot of what is India post the colonial rule since 47, and had the advantage of going through several rounds of thinking and planning for the country. But as Gautam would put it in his book, 91 saw reform from being, or from earlier being, under sort of repressive regime, in the sense of economy being controlled, economy being regulated tightly, and economy also being under strict license regulations. So he very effectively carries through the spirit of how the economy has come to be what it is today, and very effectively also looks at what it would have been if the route had been slightly different, in that the Bombay Plan had envisaged a certain way of, entrepreneurial way of thinking about it, although it was drafted by large, very big businessmen, addressing poverty but yet keeping the entrepreneurial skill intact was probably the spirit with which the Bombay Plan was written. But then later, of course, some of the recommendations of the Bombay Plan did find its way in several of the plans, but the overall shroud with which the economy was taken forward was not necessarily in the spirit of the Bombay Plan. It's not my intention here to say the Bombay Plan is all very glorified and it should have been fully carried through. But the author captures the essence of how that ran parallel, but yet the spirit of the 47 to 91 was slightly different from the spirit of what was in Bombay Plan. So that's been beautifully captured. And also the international context has also been very well captured by the author. Listing out of the various reforms since after 91 and even the ones before, and probably giving just a page or a page and a half for each of them makes it easy for people who would want to have a quick picture of how it's flown since 47 to today. So that's a very good attractive feature for any reader. I'm sure most of you all have read it, but for those who have not read it, I think that would be one of the features, saying very quick picture of how reform after reform India has been building. And the momentum has been far more since 91. The numbers themselves speak. He captures 69 post-1991 and only 8 before 1991. So the pace at which reforms have happened and the kinds of reforms, whether it is governance reform, taxation reform, or policy reform, regulatory reform, he captures it all. So that way, it's an exhaustive attempt at getting the picture of how economy and reforms feed into each other. The only speed breaker, if any, which is also very well captured by the author, is the political conviction. Sometimes the priority of those in politics and also the decision makers, how they come into play either positively or otherwise is also well captured, and the difficulties of taking decision in 91 finds a very detailed narrative. So that way, I think you've spent a lot of time in looking at how the processes have worked in favor sometimes, and some other times, even if the economic arguments are very much in favor, political conviction is available as well. Taking the example of the 3 farm laws, which had to be withdrawn, where the political conviction is there, the stability of regime is there. Talking about the Washington consensus, he goes into those details as well. Political consensus or the political stability, conviction for reforms, all of them existing, notwithstanding. The farm laws had to be withdrawn. And there the author rightly says, there is no economic argument against it. Because year after year after year, several committees, several standing committees, several specifically appointed committees, all of them have gone into the virtues of reforming farm businesses. But yet it couldn't find the light of the day. So the trajectory that reforms in India take up, sometimes very bumpy, sometimes like a cycle you come back, have all been very beautifully captured. The fact that he captures the economy, its profile, and the way in which things have changed since after 91 is very beautifully represented by the fact that he says that when in 86, the stock market indices, the Sensex came in, from among the 30 companies then, there are only 6 which continue to be. Am I right? You've quoted that. There are only 6 that continue to be in the Sensex list today. Many new companies have come in, others have all dropped out. Just 6 of the 30, which means the profile of the Indian economy as related to sensitive, big-time, influential, stable companies which find a listing is changed so much. So that itself tells you what reform has done for the economy and why further reforms are necessary. But of course, he goes into greater detail of how reforms get strengthened by institutional support, and there he has a beautiful string of thought to say how the American way of thinking, American institutions, American think tanks, all support policy making, which to an extent was also shadowed in India. Then you have the institutions probably taken over by the left philosophies, left ideologies, and therefore you have Indian policy making also very, very much infused with that kind of a flavor. You have then the left and the left liberals. And so it goes, as much as it's happening in the US, the Chinese, whose influence, whose model, Chinese model of growth, which influences the thought processes in the universities or think tanks, which happened till very recently in the academia in the US. All this is also captured, and I'm happy to see that at one go he stretches the full semicircle of the umbrella. And even as he does that, he comes back to talking about the individual reforms, like trickles of water which, hit the umbrella but yet get sprayed down to the earth. So the looking into details, getting into specifics, at the same time, every time going back to weave the theoretical framework behind it, are very interesting, and it's something which I think gives the reader the advantage within a book of what in the last 75 years India has gone through in the name of planning for economy. A very interesting fact which comes out of this book, but which gives a lesson for policymakers, is institutional memory will have to be something in which all of us will have to invest. When he talks about the way in which he gathered information on the Bombay plan, for instance, he says, I've put in much more effort than is required to even find a copy of it. Am I right? Tells you how much a critical document for India's economy and its planning, which should have been natural course available easily for anybody, requires a researcher of that kind of a level to spend so much time. Doesn't speak so much for us, for our documentation abilities and for our institutional memory purposes. These are things which I would strongly take it for myself, at least, that we should strengthen the institutional memory, which is so important for us. Similarly, he talks about tracing and tracking difficulties of the 1948 resolution. It was called the resolution, but it was one of the major steps, one of the major 8 steps that was pre-1991. Gautam is right in saying even that it was very difficult for him to obtain. So I think it is very important that books such as this are not read just for references or not just read for the sake of knowing what the content is about, but the messages they give in terms of documentation, preserving certain historical evidences are so critical. And it's right that you have mentioned it, and I think it's important for India to remember that as we sit in Nehru Memorial Museum Library, it is important to document, it is important to keep a very good catalog, and it's important to make it available for researchers in time. To end the discussions, he also comes up with a triple trinity that India will have to face as we go forward. And that was a very enchanting way of putting out as to what is important, where the attention of the policymakers should go. I quite appreciate it. It's worth recalling. He says the first trinity is of technology, geopolitics, and narrative building. Very relevant for today. And the next trinity that he talks about is producers, consumers, and regulators, the essential stakeholders in an economy, which actually the set of three would always be the ones at play, and that's what is going to give the economy its robustness. And the third one is very futuristic, somewhat abstract, and if you have to derive policy from it, it's going to take a bit of effort, but nevertheless, the third trinity is where he says, dismantle the colonial legal framework. The legal infrastructure that prevails will have to be dismantled. I thought it had a semblance to what the Prime Minister has been speaking as Panch Pran, where the first of it is to get over that mindset, get over the colonial mindset, is what the Prime Minister has been saying from Red Fort, August 15th, 2022. And here I find the third trinity, the first one in the third trinity, triple trinity, is to dismantle the colonial legal infrastructure. The second in that is to reinstate India as a major player in the global economy. And third, he says that India should play a very important and pivotal role in redrafting emerging new world order, which is, I think, a very important job. And representing the voice of the South is what the PM has been speaking about, particularly in the context of the G20, in which India holds the presidency this year. So representing the voice of the South and also speaking for greater representation of the South in multilateral institutions, be it banking or multilateral funding institutions, India, together with the South, global South, will have to find its place. And the reform of the multilateral institutions is certainly something which we will put on the top of our agenda. So, in a way, without taking much of your time, I find this is a very time-serving today, in the sense, very contemporaneously required, necessary manual, if I can call this book that. And it comes out with very important reference material for us, gives a very good picture of the Indian economy. Just one thing which I would want to say with a little apologies. I don't want to get into specifics of what is in the book, but this is, I thought, important. In Reform 16, it's mentioned about how new normal for personal income tax rates. Thankfully, the only place in which my name appears. It says, and I read here, under Prime Minister H.D. Deve Gowda, Finance Minister P. Chidambaram, created a three-part tax structure, 10%, 20%, 30%, that remained unchanged until recently. This elegant structure continued till under the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman brought 7 slabs and 4 surcharges, reversing the gains of simplicity created after decades of harassment. Unquote. And if Gautam would pardon, if Gautam would pardon me, if indeed they were gains of simplicity, I want to reassure him, they've not been reversed. People are filing taxes, their returns even today under it. I have not reversed any of this, nor has Prime Minister Modi reversed this gains of simplicity. It still is there. But it's not at all simple. I would want to tell you that. It has full of exemptions. For every rate, for every tax assessee, it has about 7, 8, 9, 10 exemptions. And with all that exemptions, the rate 10, 20, 30 continue. It continues even today, I assure you. We've not removed it. But what we have done in the name of simplicity and to avoid harassment, reversing the gains of simplicity created after decades of harassment. Removing harassment is what was aimed at when we brought in faceless tax assessment. And even today, I can tell you with certain level of confidence that if there are harassment or if people are willing to talk about it, there is a system through which it gets sorted out. So harassment was addressed by us, one. Second, in order to keep the simplicity and not deny those who want to enjoy the old simplicity, we've kept that system intact, it continues. But we've come up with a parallel system which has no exemptions whatsoever, but which has simpler, more favorable rates. And may not be the time for me to bicker on statistics, but I'd like to say this here. The reason why I had to bring in 7 slabs was to make simpler and lower rates for those who are in the lower incomes. So just indulge me for a moment. The old tax system, which still continues, had only 5, 20, and 30 slabs other than the nil rate. And 10 lakh and above were under 30%. 5 to 10 lakhs were under 20%. 2.5 to 5 lakhs were under 5%. And those below 2.5 were at nil rate. So what we did in bringing a new parallel system without exemptions of any kind, you just pay that amount and you're done with, was to bring in, yes, 7 slabs, only to make sure that those below 10 and below were not going to be taxed at 30%, they were going to be taxed at only 15%. We reduced it. We reduced it further down to 5% for 2.5 and 5 lakhs and so on. So no one, till they reached 15 lakh and above, had to pay 30% at all. So for everyone, there was a reduction by at least 5 to 10% in the tax rates, and no exemptions were allowed. It was a straightforward. So just one little correction. And in fact, probably I would have given the little advantage to correct it had only I had the opportunity to meet up with the author before the book was finalized. Unfortunately, I didn't have the chance of meeting him or even having any discussion about the book because I didn't even know that he was writing one. So pardon me for doing this here, but thank you.